Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Jennifer Egan's new novel, The Candy House, is a sibling novel to her Pulitzer-Prize and National Book Critics Circle-winning novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad. Spanning decades, we meet a tech billionaire who ushers in a new age of enhanced digital sharing, the anthropologist who unwittingly enabled this new era, eluders who seek to retain privacy and discretion in the face of the onslaught, and the proxies who impersonate them, plus record producers, aging rock stars, movie stars, spies, publicists, writers, academics, mothers, fathers, and children. Jennifer Egan is the author of 6 previous books of fiction, including Manhattan Beach and the aforementioned A Visit from the Goon Squad, as well as The Keep. It is a great pleasure to welcome Jennifer Egan to this week's book show. Jennifer, how are you?
I am well, and I'm happy to be talking to you.
I am very happy to have you here. I am a big fan of your work, and I look forward to talking to you about it. The word, and I know this is like a PR word, but I still find it interesting that referring to this book as a sibling novel to Goon Squad, which is, of course, different than a sequel. But I'm wondering of how you looked at it in your mind of what you wanted to accomplish with it.
Well, I think it reconnects with the world of Goon Squad. I think the reason sequel in a way doesn't work for these books is that neither one is chronological. So sequel, presumes a sequence. And in fact, there's no reason that you would, if you were going to read both, you could just as easily read Candy House and then Goon Squad, because they're not chronological, but they do share certain characters. Minor characters in the Candy House are major characters in Goon Squad, and vice versa. And both are sort of built around the principle of curiosity, so that you sort of catch a glimpse of someone from the corner of your eye. They seem to be the quote unquote minor character, but then you find yourself maybe in the next chapter or maybe a few chapters later plunged into the middle of that person's point of view, which is kind of a reminder that, in fact, there are no minor characters in real life. Each of us is our own specific universe of experience and history and people.
So I may be successful in asking this question or not, but I find it interesting in the sense that when you look at Candy House, that the idea is a lot of moving parts. It's the same thing with Goon Squad. And is that the way it is approached in the writing?
Yes. I mean, I tend to write them in pieces and then look at the pieces and find out what story they're telling me, and then write further into that. So in the case of A Visit from the Goon Squad, it became clear over time, the book is very much about the music industry, that the genre I was using was really that of the concept album, in which different pieces of music that sound very different from each other come together into one big story arc. And in The Candy House, it became clear to me that it was something a little more game oriented, in which we're sort of moving among worlds as we move in and out of chapters, almost like you would do in, say, a tabletop Dungeons and Dragons game, where you're moving in and out of different scenes and worlds on different sheets of graph paper. And in a sense, that is the case when you move in and out of different people's points of view, because we are each our own world and perceive the world so differently. So I had a slightly different way of justifying for myself, in terms of a genre, how these different pieces end up being together. But these are ensemble books that work in a more kaleidoscopic way than just a straightforward, beginning to end story.
I think it's safe to say in a kaleidoscope that can look different ways to different people at different times, and that's okay with you.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, that's true of any book,
Yes.
Not just a Kaleidoscope. I've had people, I have readers, in fact, that whole idea of the concept album with A Visit from the Goon Squad, I didn't consciously realize that that was what I was doing until readers pointed it out to me. And even though I had an A and a B section in the book, so there's a lot of impulse and improvisation in my writing method. And although I do many, many, many drafts and certainly am weighing every word by the time a book is done, a lot of what I've ended up doing is revealed to me by my readers. And people, of course, read books in different ways. And when people don't like a book, for example, that's not their failing. I mean, I feel like that's the book's failing. We can't please everyone. But it's once I let this book out into the world, it belongs to everyone else. That's how it works. And that's fine.
I'm stuck on the word that you used a moment ago of impulse. Give me an idea of how that is apropos of an impulsive moment where you can write something that perhaps was not on the docket at the beginning of the day.
Well, there's very little on the docket when I write my first draft. So just to give you an example, I'll start with the first chapter of The Candy House. So we begin with a character who's a very minor character in Goon Squad named Bix Boughton.
Right.
We find him in New York at age 41 in 2010, having already invented social media. So he's hyper famous, easily recognizable, and having a little bit of a midlife crisis because he's not sure what he wants to do next. And he's only 41. So I kind of knew that going in. I had an idea about where he was in his life. And then I just began writing. And I usually begin with a physical environment. And in this case, it was sort of New York City at night. So Bix goes in disguise. I began writing improvisationally, as I always do, and found him in disguise so that people won't realize he is his famous self, going to an academic discussion group at Columbia University in hopes of reconnecting with that sort of college and grad school version of himself, which is when he got his original idea, and hoping somehow to be stimulated by this group that he's infiltrating as pretending to be a grad student, hoping he'll be stimulated in a way that he can't be, surrounded by people who basically tell him what they think he wants to hear because he's running a massive tech company.
Right.
That situation seemed inherently comic to me. This super famous guy is in disguise in this group. And so I just started writing from there. But the real surprise came when I found, as I moved forward in this story, that Bix is on the subway. And lo and behold, one of the people in the group, a rather attractive graduate student, female, is on the subway with him. And now suddenly it's not the same to deceive a group of people as it is to be one-on-one in disguise. And he's immediately uncomfortable. He's also not used to taking the subway because he usually is in a car service. And so he starts to get very anxious and he keeps trying to escape from her. But every move he makes, she seems to be doing the same thing. They both end up getting off the subway at the same stop. And again, so writing in an improvisational way, I found myself amused by this because there are just a lot of comic elements there. He's awkward and uncomfortable, and she perceives it and basically confronts him and says, "Are you who you say you are?" Meaning this graduate student. He then admits he's not and tells her who he is, and she refuses to believe him. And they have this absurd interaction where he's now trying to persuade her that he is the very person he's been pretending not to be himself. And it just becomes kind of crazy. That's the kind of thing that I can only get to through improv. I can't seem to think that stuff up.
Do you find that if you are making yourself laugh and you are entertaining yourself, that is something that will work well in the novel?
I mean, it's not always about humor. What I would say is that fiction is where I go as a reader and a writer to feel things. That starts with the physical environment and sensory perceptions. And I think that's one reason that's where I start in my improvisational first drafts. Where are we? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is the vibe and the atmosphere? The next question is, who is perceiving it? And then suddenly we're in the realm of character. And then what does that person or those people do and say? Now we're getting into the realm of plot. So that's kind of how it starts. But sometimes where it goes in the realm of feeling is painful, and that's good too.
Sure.
We go to novels to feel all of that. In terms of humor, generally, if I'm laughing, which is pretty rare, that's a good sign. Although there's a chapter in this book, which is actually the next chapter, about a guy named Alfred who is obsessed with what he thinks is very artificial behavior in the people around him and decides to thwart this by beginning a practice of screaming in public in order to generate authentic responses. I found him highly amusing and I was laughing my head off, but I couldn't find a way to make that chapter work. So it took a while. In other words, getting to the funny part is not enough. In the end, it has to be part of a larger story that has a kind of organic strength to it, or the laughter dissipates and where are we?
There is a chapter in the book. I was reading along and I'm enjoying the book immensely. And then I come to the chapter Rhyme Scheme. And this is just, I love this so much. I'm just going to read one line or two lines here just to give the listener an idea. But, and then I want to ask you about it. M has 4 primary freckles on her nose and approximately 24 secondary freckles. I say approximately not because her secondary freckles can't be counted. Few things in this world can't be counted, but because I can't stare at M's nose for long enough to count her secondary freckles without making her uncomfortable. Her hair is thicker than the hair of 40% of the women who work among us and longer than 57%, and she wears hair bands 24% of the time, scrunchies 28% of the time, and her hair loose 48% of the time. It goes on for many pages. That is thrilling to read. Is it just a rush to write?
I did the fewest drafts of that chapter from beginning to end that I've ever done of anything. So I'm a multi-draft person because when you write in an improvisational way, what you end up with is a mess that hopefully has some interesting stuff in it. And then I use that interesting stuff to make a book or a story. But in this case, and so I've had as many as 70 drafts of a chapter of a book easily. With this one, from beginning to end, 8 drafts. So it was a rush. And one thing that made it a rush is that the way Lincoln thinks, the quantitative way that he observes the world could not be further from my way of observing the world if I had simply sat down and thought, I'm going to write about my opposite. Because I am a person who never got past trigonometry in sophomore year of high school. And I'm not a very mathematical person. So the reason it was such a rush to write as Lincoln is that it did the thing that I look to fiction for above all as a reader and a writer, which is to remove me from my point of view and my modes of perception and place me inside another mind. No other narrative art form that currently exists does this. I just want to say that. Anything that is image-based, if you are looking at a picture, you are on the outside. But this feeling of being on the inside of another sensibility that looks at the world in a way that is so far from my own is a complete blast. So yeah. It was so much fun to be Lincoln because it was so much not like being me. And I'll just say one more thing about that. I wrote the first draft of this in 2012 by hand, which is how I do my first drafts because it helps with this improvisational phase. I didn't even type it up. And when I took it back out in 2016, so 4 years later, having written another book in the interim, and typed it up, I thought, who wrote this? Who thinks this way? And I felt like it wasn't me.
That's fascinating that there is a removal, that you can become detached from it that ultimately quickly seems interesting to me.
Well, I think it's just a measure of how far it is from my way of perceiving.
Right.
And interestingly, so Lincoln has a sister, Addison. And by the way, we've met both of these characters in Goon Squad. There's a chapter from Allison's point of view in Goon Squad, and Lincoln is a more secondary character. In this case, it's the opposite. They're both adults. We're in Lincoln's point of view. He calls Addison a romantic or an impressionist because she does not see the world numerically or quantitatively. I am much more, if we're going to adhere to Lincoln's categories, which came to me pretty spontaneously, I'm much more like his sister Addison. And that's something that I like. I like taking the point of view that is opposed to my point of view and exploring that. Because I know what my point of view is. I don't really need to spend more time in it. I'm looking to be lifted out of it. It's a very thrilling feeling to be relieved of my point of view.
When I just spoke the first few lines of that chapter, I read very quickly. When I read it at home, I read through it very quickly. Do you write it quickly?
I do. My first drafts are very quick, but that is intentional. Not so. It's not that it's always working the way things, fell into place more easily with this chapter. Even if what I'm writing ends up being terrible and I don't even bother to type it up, and that was the case for about 50% of the first draft material of both Goon Squad and the Candy House. There's a high failure ratio. When I don't even type it, it's not even that good. I still write it really fast. And the reason I do that is that I'm trying not to think. Thinking is the enemy of improvisation. And I've never done musical improv or theatrical improv. So I'm blathering here as if I knew, and I don't. But when I've witnessed it, it seems clear that the goal is just to keep going. You don't stop on stage and say, should we continue with this? No, you just do it. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. But going fast is a way of staying ahead of my own judgment. And judgment comes into the process a lot, but not at that early phase.
The part I just read, you said, and you said just a moment ago, too, of being the furthest away from your way of thinking, that it's so polar opposite. And yet you are a puzzle master. There is a puzzle quality to it. And that seems to fit into that whether we're talking about numbers or names or people or places, a mind, especially one that is adept at puzzling, can decipher and make a puzzle and solve the puzzle.
One thing that I learned, and this was a little bit from my sons, who were, kids growing up in the years that I was working on this book, there are some interesting modes of storytelling that are very quantitative. And puzzling in and of itself is a kind of storytelling. You could look at a murder mystery as a puzzle. You could probably diagram it. Here are the suspects. We're looking this way. Is it that one? Okay, no, we've eliminated that one. So I in some ways, they really helped me to find my way into some more quantitative modes of storytelling. One of the ways they did that is one of my sons was really into Dungeons and Dragons, and he would host a group every week at our house, and I would bake for them, which was my way of getting to eavesdrop a little bit on their game, which was in the kitchen. And I was struck by how quantitative the storytelling was. In other words, people and creatures of all kinds have various adventures, but those adventures are driven by rolls of the dice, which determine character traits and ultimately who moves where and who wins battles. So that was interesting. And the other thing is that my other son showed me how looking at, say, a table of baseball stats about a player's career is also a form of storytelling. We see what happened when. We see, for example, that when this player gets traded, his numbers fall. So then if he's injured and traded multiple times, his numbers fall to the point where he falls back into the minors, and that can be the end of a career. So I think that I became aware through them of the relationship between statistics, if you will, and storytelling. And there's a lot of that in this book.
If a reader comes to you and says, Jennifer, I love the book, but I got to tell you, there are just parts of it I just didn't understand. I assume that happens. Is that okay?
Everything is okay. My first, I have two reactions to that. The first one is always, I'm sorry, because it is not anyone's job to like any piece of fiction. It is my job as the writer to make it so irresistible that people miss their subway stops, stay up too late, and feel transported. That's my goal, and anything less is a failure. The one other thing I would say, though, is that I think sometimes people feel like they need to make all these connections between the chapters, and they don't. Any more than if you go to a party and you see someone you've met before and maybe they know that other person, you don't need to go into the restroom and spend 20 minutes trying to put all those connections together. You're just there to have fun. That's kind of how I see this. It's not anyone's job to follow every connection. Just be where you are and let the connections happen if they do.
So what you've just described sounds to me like kind of a Rorschach way of thinking of it.
I think that that's true of all fiction because, I use lots of readers in my process. I should say that I have a writing group, so I bring work into them early, and then I have layers of other readers who read it. So I try to get lots of different feedback so that I account for various confusions or problems or weak points and make it as strong as I can before it goes into the world. But anything that's really good should be open to multiple interpretations over multiple years. I mean, if you let's think about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
We're still going to Shakespeare plays. That's pretty amazing. And it's because there are many ways to read his plays. Thousands of academics over hundreds of years have spent their careers analyzing Shakespeare's work. And of course, their viewpoints are multiple and diverse. And the only reason that we're still watching those plays is that they still feel relevant. So ideally, that is how flexible and sturdy and and interpretable a work of fiction should be.
Jennifer Egan is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is The Candy House by the Pulitzer-Prize winning author of A Visit from the Goon Squad. It is published by Scribner. A lot has been made when Goon Squad came out and continued to be made when this book was released about you and working with and tinkering with form. There is a chapter in the book called Lulu the Spy 2032, which basically has the narrative in two columns. And is that conscious, as you say, when you're writing it out in longhand, does it come out that way?
That's a great question. The way I wrote it, I tried writing it on legal pad, which is what I usually do. And those long dangly lines didn't work for this piece. So I always knew that Lulu, who is in her 30s and is working for the US government to infiltrate a group of plotters against America, and she's recording her actions in the form of lessons. So instead of saying, I did this, I did that, she is recording them in terms of what she learned from each step she takes. So it's a list. It's a story in the form of a list of lessons. And somehow I always knew that those lessons would not be in long, dangly lines. So what I did was I actually found a notebook that at a Japanese store that contained 8 rectangles on each page. And I wrote my first draft inside those rectangles. And you could actually see this on my website, jenniferegan.com. If you look at the homepage and click on the little different bits of text, you'll read the first page of each chapter as published, including this one. And if you hover over the first paragraph, that dissipates and you're looking at a typed up first draft that's marked up by hand. And below that, you get to the actual first draft. So you can see what this notebook looked like with my writing in it. But it's, the interesting thing about why I used that form was that I wanted to tell a story in list form. And the list form is what let me write about Lulu as a spy without it feeling like a basically sort of pretty generic spy story that I think would not be that interesting. This list lesson approach is what let me come fresh to a genre that is really an old one at this point, and to which I might not have all that much to add without this kind of unusual presentation.
The presentation of the list, you have many. Is it safe to say they're chapters within it's numbered, so that those would be chapters within the list?
Absolutely, and each chapter is sort of just a a very small unit of action that Lulu undertakes. I mean, what she's doing is she's essentially, is a kind of prostitute. I mean, that's what she's been hired to be. That is her way of infiltrating this group of men, even though she's an American who's married and has a life, but this is a kind of service that she's undertaken. So each phase of action, which includes things like going into the room of this man she's supposed to be recording, or going to dinner, or then losing track of him and finding him. Each small phase of the action is its own, I guess you would say, chapter, but a kind of microscopic chapter.
How good are you at this point? I would assume pretty damn good, but of keeping track of all of the characters and how you left them at any given time.
I didn't have trouble with that any more than we have trouble remembering where our family members are, because I come to know these people so well in the course of writing them. But what I do have trouble with, and I actually have trouble with this in my family too, is just keeping track of people's ages. Like, when were they born? How old are my nieces? I have a lot of nieces. So that I required a pretty careful not graph, but just a sort of table that shows when everyone was born and how old each person we've encountered in either of these books is at any particular point in time. But beyond that, no. And that's why I say I really encourage people not to worry about all of these connections, because I was not worrying about them as I wrote. I did not reread A Visit from the Goon Squad until I was almost done with The Candy House. And in fact, I waited too long. I had a bunch of facts wrong about my own characters and had to do rewriting just to bring the two books into alignment in terms of people's histories. So, but ages are tricky.
Jennifer Egan's new novel is The Candy House. It is published by Scribner. Jennifer, what an absolute delight to speak to you. Thank you very much for being with us.
It was such a joy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Jennifer Egan's new novel is The Candy House, published by Scribner. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue.